Welcome back to the RegRapPod. I am your host, Alan Booth, Managing Editor of the Regulatory Rapporteur here at Topper in London, and thank you again for listening. Joining me today on the pod to discuss focus articles in the journal's June issue is Sarah Roberts, who is Vice President and Head of Global Regulatory Affairs ICON, and you might say as Topper royalty, as one of our past presidents in charge back in 2015. You're very welcome, Sarah. Thanks for joining me.
Lovely, and thank you for inviting me along to what is my very first ever podcast. So I look forward to our discussion on what I felt was a really interesting issue of Regulatory Rapporteur.
This episode of the RegRapPod corresponds to Regulatory Rapporteur June 2023, which is Volume 20, Issue 6. In this episode, we'll be hearing from Sarah about the content of the issue, the focus topic of which was clinical trials.
Are you a Topper member? As the leading global membership organisation for professionals in regulatory affairs, our benefits continue to support thousands of Topper members to succeed and excel in their careers. Whether you work in pharmaceuticals, medical devices and IVDs, or veterinary medicines, in industry, at a regulatory body, or as a consultant, Topper membership will support your professional development and enable you to achieve your career goals. Join Topper before 31st of July 2023 and enjoy all the benefits of membership up until the 31st of December 2024 for just £290.
Hello again, Sarah. You are now the pod's fifth guest overall, and it's great to be speaking to you today. At this point, and before we properly get going, please can I also thank you for being a solo editor and super sub coming off the bench when the original editor who was planning out this issue was unable to continue. While we do endeavour to work to timelines which are reasonably long in advance, you stepped up at short notice. Sometimes life takes a turn and nudges things off course, but it's been reassuring to have a safe pair of hands.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's absolutely fine. I've been an issue editor over a number of issues, and whilst normally it's nice to be working in partnership with someone, partially because you meet somebody new and you get to share their ideas and thoughts on something, it's also fine to be the editor on my own, although there was quite a lot of pressure to make sure I met the timelines.
Well, thank you. Okay, so let's get started. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the articles in this issue of the journal and pulling back the curtain a little bit on the overall process and hearing more about the content. Shall we take each of the focus articles in turn? Firstly, colleagues at PPD, which of course is part of Thermo Fisher, Pedro Barossa Inacio and Stefani Dilova wrote the article entitled Decentralized Clinical Trials, a European Union Recommendation Paper. Now, this article focuses on the EU's recently published recommendation paper, which provides consolidated guidance for sponsors planning decentralized clinical trials, irrespective of any health-related crisis, as part of the so-called ACT EU initiative, which is the bloc's programme for accelerating clinical trials in the European Union. Please, can you tell us more?
Yes, of course. So this is a really interesting article on decentralized trials, and actually I think we need to break it down a bit further into those sort of decentralized elements in clinical trials, because that's really around the recommendation paper from the EMA. And when we look at decentralized elements, we're looking principally at four key areas. So technology, and we can think about e-consent versus remote consent, e-COAs, and wearables, apps and devices. We also think about home health, about concierge services, and also direct patient supply of IMP. And a lot of these elements have been part of your standard clinical trials for a very long time. So some of these elements have been around for 10 to 15 years when you think about COAs and how we've deployed those on studies. So really, these decentralized elements really are looking at activities that would occur in a protocol, but outside of a typical investigator site. So more recently, particularly since the COVID pandemic, we've really had to evolve our thinking around how we deliver clinical studies, what elements those investigators are involved with, and the role that the sponsor plays in bringing some of these technologies, these home health deliverables together under a protocol. So we've had to really think about how your protocol is written, what support we can give those investigators, and how that's woven in. So more recently, we've just had issued the FDA draft DCT guidance. That's currently undergoing a consultation process. We've got the EMA recommendation paper, which is reviewed here, and that was based on really some guidance that came out of Denmark. But now, more recently, we've had the new revision, R3 revision to ICH GCP, so ICH E6. And that revision is also incorporating certain DCT elements, such as informed consent being paper and in brackets and electronic. And also talks about how the sponsor can provide support to the investigator around some of the data gathering technology, although under GCP, the investigator remains accountable for its supervision. I think all of these papers coming together really show that there is building and gathering momentum across all of the regions of the world. And actually, it's a testament from the EMA recommendation paper, the FDA, but also now ICH coming on board to really get sort of small seedlings of growth around the considerations of what these sorts of trials and these elements bring to these trials, and creating a more harmonized approach across all of these countries. And I think that's an extraordinary feat that we're seeing such collaboration between these, very different competent authorities around the globe, and their thinking and how they're really trying to now make sure that the future success of clinical trials, we're going to have to think differently to how we thought in the past, that you would have an investigator at a site that did all of these activities without the supplementation of these DCT elements. The final piece is around, with the ICH E6 revision, is around that there's a linked concept paper, and that concept paper talks about a new annex to ICH GCP. So there's Annex 2, which has got additional considerations for a variety of different trial designs. And one of those trials designs is the DCT elements in trials. So again, considering around sort of like the ecosystems of all the regulations and guidance support these sorts of studies, I think this is a well-poised article and really goes into some detail about the EMA recommendations.
And when you think about the work that CROs undertake, and traditionally recruiting principal investigators at sites that might then have a lot of responsibility for their patients, are they welcoming of the changes? Is it working out for them as well as for the industry?
Yeah, and I think absolutely, and I think CROs are really well placed, because we see a variety of different trials. You would have typically seen quite a lot of DCT elements in those rare disease studies, but gradually more and more, because of the nature of the work, the nature of our healthcare systems in a lot of countries, means that we have to be more flexible, more nimble. We have to think differently. So I think most of the CROs are well poised for this. We have partnerships or in-house technologies which we can use to support studies, but also work with a great deal of providers to ensure successful delivery of decentralized elements on studies.
And do you think there's going to be any particular therapeutic area that's going to be more suited to this kind of framework now?
As I mentioned in the past, rare diseases have certainly incorporated a number of what we now consider to be decentralized elements into their studies. I think when you start thinking about it, it can be very easy to focus on the technology, but if you think about some of the home health, some of the concierge type services, some of the direct to patient products, it could very well be that we're seeing, again, a significant leverage of DCT elements in those biotech type large molecule complex disease areas where you have a limited patient population, and we need to ensure that we are allowing those patients to have access to these studies and those concierge programs, potentially take away the need to be co-located near a large hospital, and allow some of those elements to be sort of outsourced to other different investigator or different solutions for that particular patient.
That's great. I think we need to move on. So next we hear from a group of authors at Merck, led by Alexa Hunter and Lisette Vromans, with our colleagues Christopher Bryce, Elmar Schmidt, Martina Hirth, and Georgios Amexis. Their article is entitled First Experiences with the Clinical Trial Regulation, a Company Perspective. Now, this is a follow-on and companion piece to a CPD supplement written by broadly the same team, which was originally published in the Regulatory Rapporteur in April 2021. That's volume 18, issue 4. And at that time was looking ahead to the incoming changes in the regulatory framework from the EU's new law. In your editorial for this issue, when considering this article, you spoke to the ambitions and expectations of the EMA's CTIS system, that's the Clinical Trials Information System. Those ambitions having not transpired fully down to, shall we say, technical and functionality issues. What did the Merck team tell us?
So the Merck article was really interesting, and it also was a summary of my regulatory career to date. So I was around in regulatory affairs when the clinical trial directive came into force. And at that time, that was very new, very novel, a real sea change in how clinical trials were managed. The new European clinical trial regulation absolutely is now another a generational change, and the sort of what it wanted to deliver, it had very grand ambitions. Now, under the directive by virtue of its nature is more flexible, and so at the time the heads of medicines agencies and were able to, and the clinical trials facilitation group were able to come up with a procedure called the voluntary harmonisation procedure. And this voluntary harmonisation procedure was really one of the precursors for the new regulation, because it allowed for some harmonisation or review. And so this article really compares that voluntary harmonisation procedure against the new clinical trial regulation and its pitfalls and its strengths. So, as I mentioned, this is a generational change. And not only is it a generational change, it is a change that has impacted industry, CROs, sponsors, regulators alike. There is not one group that is necessarily got an advantage in this whole piece currently. And as the technology was being developed, the CTIS system, there were a lot of global political issues that impacted its development. So one of those being Brexit and the movement of the EMA from London, that impacted their ability, their focus away from that to moving that big institution, as well as then the COVID pandemic. So some of the development pathways for the CTIS system haven't really been fully realised. And I think that is evidenced with the publication of a multiple page document of workarounds pretty much the day before the CTIS system went live. So we were aware of the sort of the issues with the CTIS system, and many companies are now investing a lot of time and a lot of energy in really understanding how the system works, all of the workarounds, which are many, and the updated Q&As, which I last checked, the February 2023 Q&A is well over 160 pages long of frequently asked questions supporting this new regulation. We're all in this learning phase. We are in the second year of it being implemented. We're about to hit another milestone in that we need to start the transition of studies that were initiated under the Clinical Trial Directive and moved them into the Clinical Trial Regulation. And I think broadly across the industry bodies, there is a concern about whether this CT system will cope with this volume of data. There are a number of other changes that have come in that have really impacted the company's preparedness and the ability to be prepared. And I think this article really covers those and compares them across to the voluntary harmonisation procedure well. But I think with all things, it's, you know, it's going to be trial and error. We're continuing to work together. There is, in general, very good communication and camaraderie between all of the big industry associations and the Commission around, you know, how we can make this work for all, because we do, you know, the basic tenets of why the EU clinical trials regulation was set up are good. We just need to have the technology and the processes to support its implementation.
So it's fair to say then that it's good regulation, but it's the problem with implementing the technology, which hampers, you know, so many sort of governmental reorganisation programs. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And, you know, we need to ensure that, you know, the main goal here was to provide European citizens with early access to medicines, or appropriate access to medicines in development, to you know, to ensure that they are in receipt of those, able to tap into that as a treatment for their condition. And, you know, we want to make sure that that's happening. The last thing anybody wants at this point in time is for companies to not be looking towards the EU to run their studies because they find the framework to support it too complex to navigate.
But it surely must still be an improvement on having to deal with individual, you know, for example, ethics committees regionally across Germany, or other of the idiosyncratic ways in which nation states were dealing with things prior to the directive that was brought into force, you know, some years ago. So, you know, we're getting, it's a work in progress.
It's definitely a work in progress, and, you know, you correctly mentioned things haven't moved on for you know, coming close to 20 years. So, you know, that's a change for people, and some people do well with change and other people don't do so well with change. So, you know, whilst you mentioned that there were different rules in different countries, that is indeed correct, and there were different questions asked and different approaches taken, which can be frustrating to companies. But we were also familiar with that, so you could predict what was going to happen. We're less familiar with this system. We can't necessarily predict what's going to happen. And so some of that has led to, you know, some frustrations, both in industry, within CROs as well. And I'm fairly certain within the regulatory authorities as well.
Right, so that was the Merck side of the story. On the flip side of the coin, in the world of CROs, and at a personal level here at home, we are firmly Team CRO. Our third article for discussion is titled Implementation of Regulation 536/2014, a CRO perspective, as we've just discussed. This collaborative writing team consisted of members from your own organisation, ICON, at various locations around Europe, and led by Anna Velimirovic, Britta Dieckhoff, Elisa Veta-Parapeteva, Irisa Romero-Matuszek, Polly Halliday, and Vicky Ayasan-Onadu. This article summarises the experience of the CRO working within both pharma and biotech firms under the new framework. As I read, certainly the first year under the newly minted regimen was a challenge, as you've just spoken to, but it also led to some workaround initiatives when the CRA was faced with, let's put this diplomatically, non-optimal functionality. So what learnings and innovations have come from the experience?
I think there have been a number of different learnings. So whilst this is a regulation, a big European clinical trial regulation, it's a far-reaching broadly impacting regulation. So, that's sometimes within regulatory groups, it's a regulation, it sits within your group to solve all of the issues. Well, actually, this was much more encompassing than that. So we had to, as an organisation, make sure we were prepared across the board, and working with multiple different stakeholder and sponsor organisations meant that we were prepared, not only looking inwardly into our organisation, but also helping them to support what they needed moving forwards. Some of the larger organisations were very prepared, and we have some very small biotech organisations, predominantly, for example, US-based, who they don't have the ability to have that footprint in Europe, so need a lot more support in understanding how we can help them work their way through this. One of the critical changes for us, which is a bigger challenge, is getting sponsors on board with the idea of the transparency side to the clinical trial regulation and the CTIS portal. So companies have to decide what information they consider to be personal information and commercial information that they would like to have redacted. And each company is different in that regard. As a CRO, we can't tell them what they consider to be commercially sensitive information, so we've had to work very closely with them. In the past, you would have had timelines based on your receipt of your final protocol, and that would be your kickoff point for many activities within starting a study up. Now we are finding we have to engage a lot earlier on with our clients for this whole transparency piece, and we have to engage with different teams within the sponsor organisations to make sure that they're fully aware of their obligations to this. The other side of it is, as I mentioned in the previous section, there is a lot of guidance. There are a lot of forums meeting around the EU CTR, which we are part of. Those industry forums, and we have representation on those. There is a lot of information that is coming out. So what we may have said to sponsor organisations 6 months ago may well have changed with different guidance coming out from the regulators. So that can be quite challenging as well. And you don't want to appear like you have misled somebody, but there were some gaps in the FAQs around transition studies, because we didn't need to get to transition studies in the first year of implementation. But now we are finding out more and more about what the requirements are for transition studies. We're able to advise our clients and sponsor organisations on the steps required to transition their studies so that they're compliant under the new regulation.
With clients in mind, maybe thinking about those who normally work in North America, US and Canada-based firms, were they surprised and shocked by what the kinds of things they were being asked to add in for the sake of transparency?
I don't think they were necessarily surprised. I think some of them welcomed it. I think we'd be more surprised if I think we're more concerned with ensuring that we've uploaded everything correctly to ensure that there are no data leaks of that commercially sensitive information. And again, that's another challenge, because this suboptimal system doesn't make that necessarily straightforward. I think from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges has been, and this is me speaking personally as somebody that's been have my career predominantly in the CRO industry, is that some of the challenges we've seen with the system are because the CRO industry, I don't believe, was as heavily involved with the creation of the system as they should have been. In some discussions with former members of the clinical trial facilitation group, there was a view that was possibly widely held that the regulation would somehow negate the need for input from CROs. And so we've ended up with this system that's very sponsor-led, but actually is actually quite difficult for us as a CRO to interact with. And there are, even just to access the CETIS system, there are different levels of users. That user interface needs to be, user profile needs to be set up by the sponsor company. Some have read-only access, some have edit access. There are different parts of the application that you can assign to different people. It just feels over-engineered. And I think there could have been a simpler solution, and I think some of that would have been from better engagement and an understanding that actually from an economic profile, there is a very valid role for CROs within our industry. And, as you mentioned, particularly for those North American or even Asia Pacific clients that are coming to Europe for the first time, they absolutely have needed our help to navigate the new CETIS system and the new regulation on how to get approvals for clinical trials.
Yeah, it does seem a little bit upside down to me that CROs, who are the backbone of the industry doing the research, and the experts that indeed are selling their services to a small biotech who might only have one molecule, are not being allowed to be on the front foot in terms of using the system in that way. And I can understand those frustrations. Okay. Time is against us, so we best move on. Now, last but not least, we have the first offering in a two-part article series from Hilary Gray, who is a graduate of Chopra's MSc programme, which is provided through our partnership with the University of Hertfordshire. Adapted here from her original 50,000 plus words dissertation, the article's title is A Critical Review and Comparison of the Processes when seeking scientific advice in the EU and the USA. Is there a difference and does it matter? I'll take that from Sarah. Sarah, you wrote in your editorial, this article provides a valuable insight to developers on the expectations of regulators on the data package required to support a successful product launch. Since this issue's publication, this article in particular has received both praise and admiration from followers of Chopra's LinkedIn posts, with one long post saying in summary, what an article, engaging and informative. I look forward to seeing what is next. In adapting this work, our colleague, the journal's editor-in-chief, Davina Stevenson, was so impressed with Helen's work that we agreed that we should take full advantage of the new online platform's literally no limits word count. Had we still been a print-only journal, we could have dedicated an entire issue to this article. So what did you think?
So I thought this was a really good article, and I suppose it's also been one of a topic and a thread running through my career as well. We've had a number of organisations that have asked us, am I best going for scientific advice here, where should I ask this? And we've also suggested that companies go and seek advice on critical and pivotal issues that may impact the protocols in development. I think it's a really useful comparison. I would say that the frameworks for new drug approvals are different in both the US and across Europe. So when you think about even at a clinical trial level, you would be assigned a program manager in the US, and that program manager would ideally see that product through so that you've got that stability and that oversight all the way across your development program. And you've also got that engagement from the FDA at that point. And the FDA itself is obviously split up into therapeutic areas. On the flip side of that, when you look at the EMA, we are we don't have such a link from that clinical trial onwards. So, you're dealing with members of the clinical trial units when you're looking at the assessment of your protocols. And so from that European scientific advice, it's really useful to have that early engagement about your product and about your development plans really early on with those rapporteurs, or what could be potential rapporteurs, when you head towards your marketing authorization. So I think this is a really useful summary and a really useful overview. I'm a firm believer. I'm not sure necessarily. I think there's been a couple of publications over the years from the EMA and others supporting or trying to talk about the story to support how following good scientific advice leads to a more successful product launch. But I think certainly in today's economic climate, it's really important for companies to have clarity about what's expected of them in a study, and whether that study will meet the robustness required to get a marketing authorization. So I think now more than ever, preparing a really robust briefing pack for the meeting, having a really good interaction with an agency and really getting clarity on their expectations for you serves a great help in getting that successful product launch, but also doing that without having to break the bank whilst getting there.
Yes, especially when you consider the timelines involved. Sadly, we are now out of time. Thank you very much, Sarah, for sharing your insights of this month's journal's content. It's been really good to speak today.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for making this a very easy first podcast. And I'm not sure if I'm going to look forward to many more, but let's leave it at that. This was a very good first podcast.
Thank you. I'd also like to add that alongside the focus articles this issue, we have 2 standalone contributions. This month, I'm pleased that we have both a VetMed piece and our semi-regular medical devices tabular roundup to bring a little balance to the human pharma medicines content. Many thanks, therefore, to Syed Ziauddin Hashmi in Australia for his piece on the changes to Australia's veterinary and agricultural chemicals oversight, and to TOPRA board members Meriar Behizad for his medical device standards update. Thank you again for joining us and listening to this episode of the RegRapPod. If you've enjoyed the programme, you can help grow our community by sharing an email or a social media link to the podcast pages on the RegRap website. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the RegRapPod. We hope that we've brought you more insight into the journal's development, and that we've given a worthwhile peek behind the curtain to meet the editors and authors and bring further understanding of the articles and content. Many thanks again to Sarah Roberts for joining us on this edition of the podcast. This episode was presented by the journal's managing editor, Alan Booth, and produced and engineered by me, Daisy Edwards, from TOPRA HQ in London. If you would like to advertise with us, please contact Eric Smith at eric@topra.org. And if you have any other queries, please email me at daisy@topra.org. We look forward to welcoming you next time, when we'll be discussing equality of access to medicines with the joint July-August issue editor, Ash Ramzan. Until then, goodbye.